Welcome to Blessed Man Meditations. My name is Andy. On this YouTube channel, I offer thoughtful responses to skeptical objections to the Christian faith. I likewise edify the saints by equipping them to provide an answer for the hope that lies within them. I hope that you find value in my work. Please like my videos, send me comments, and please subscribe. Let's work together to contend earnestly for the faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. Blessed Man Meditations is where we provide answers to the intellectual side of Christianity and equip Christians to provide a defense for the hope that is in them, according to 1 Peter 3:15. On Blessed Man Meditations, we've been going through the book Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. For those who don't know, Eric Metaxas is a best-selling author whose books have been translated into 25 languages. He's the host of a nationally syndicated radio show and the acclaimed conversation series Socrates in the City. He's a prominent cultural commentator whose work has appeared in the likes of the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and the Wall Street Journal. On the Wall Street Journal website some time ago, Metaxas wrote an article talking about the scientific evidence for the existence of God. The web address for that article is below. Today on Blessed Man Meditations, we continue our look at Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas, specifically Part 2, The Stones Will Cry Out in Chapter 11, More Biblical Archaeology, 3 Misbehaving Boys Who Changed History. We'll see what that means as we go through it. We're going to talk about how misbehaving boys led to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Hezekiah's Tunnel, and the Silver Ketef Hinnom Scrolls. The story of how archaeology continues to confirm the Bible itself contains 3 stories that beg to be told. In their own way, each illuminates the Old Testament as a faithful and scrupulous account of history. Each also takes place in or very near Jerusalem. But without doubt, the most peculiar, if not downright ludicrous, parallel among them is that each of these 3 stories, spanning 99 years, one from the year 1880, one from 1947, and one from 1979, has at its very center as principal actor a misbehaving young man between the ages of 12 and 15. We will present the stories in order of how badly behaved the young men were, beginning with the least misbehaved. To introduce a story of what may be the greatest archaeological discovery of all time, we should clarify that when we think of archaeological discoveries, we typically think of stones. Yet this discovery was not of stones, but of manuscripts. The principal difference between them is that stones do not decay over time, while manuscripts do decay over time, except perhaps in this story, which is the first reason why the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is so spectacular. Because manuscripts deteriorate rather quickly, the knowledge we have of ancient history is overwhelmingly from rather recent manuscripts, meaning copies of manuscripts from centuries earlier. For example, Julius Caesar wrote a chronicle of his military successes in ancient Gaul, titled The Gallic Wars, during the 1st century BC, but the oldest surviving copy of the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar is a manuscript from the 8th century AD, some 900 years after the original. What manuscripts we have from the Greek historian Herodotus are still further removed from the originals. Herodotus lived and wrote in the 5th century BC, but our oldest manuscripts of the writings of Herodotus are from the 10th through the 14th centuries AD, somewhere between 13 to 1700 years later. No one doubts their authenticity, despite the eons of time since the original words were written, mainly because there are innumerable ways of corroborating information from various sources to determine if what we have is reliable and accurate. Of course, calculating such things is the important work of historians. But when we're dealing with the Bible, one finds a predictably high level of skepticism, especially among those who don't take the text very seriously. Yes, Metaxas is pointing out the point that we don't question the authenticity of the manuscripts of Julius Caesar or Herodotus, and they're not as the copies of those are not as close to the originals as those from the Bible. Thus, many have claimed the Bible texts were changed in the course of their being copied over the centuries by the monks of the Middle Ages. Skeptics suggest the monks, in league with the all-powerful church, transformed them into what the church wanted, rather than what they originally were. Though oft repeated, no evidence has ever been shown of this, and many reasons argue decisively against it. So there's arguments, though people claim that people manipulated, the skeptics claim that religious people manipulated the manuscripts to suit those that want to believe in the Bible or believe in Christianity. The skeptics will make that claim, but there is no evidence to support that skeptical claim. Evidence against this thinking emerges constantly, but the events of the story following demonstrated the theory once and for all. At first blush, this tale of a boy discovering inconceivably valuable treasure hidden in a cave seems to have been torn from a book of fairy tales, but it actually happened in 1947. Rather than being a fictitious story, it really did happen. We're going to talk about the return of Israel. The year 1947 marked the birth of the modern state of Israel, an event that almost seems to have come from a book of fairy tales itself. Here was an ancient nation that had not existed for 2,000 years, suddenly born anew. How could such a thing happen? It was a reversal of, dare we say it, biblical proportions, and a turning of history's tables as dramatic as anything. It is especially remarkable, when we consider the dramatic end of Israel in 70 AD. That apocalyptic nightmare happened less than 40 years after Jesus' striking prophecy, in which he declared that Herod's temple, that impossibly magnificent wonder of the ancient world, would be destroyed, such that one stone would not lie on top of another. And so it happened, just as Jesus said it would. The brutal Romans burned the temple to the ground and murdered 1 million Jews in what must be among the most terrible events in human history, gruesomely enough detailed for us by the historian Josephus. The Jewish people were scattered to the four winds throughout the Roman Empire and wandered the world for almost 2 millennia, suffering pogroms and persecutions until the most ghastly, unthinkable nightmare in history befell them in the Holocaust, in which 6 million of them were murdered with a meticulousness so chilling that it must forever stand as one of the most perfect examples of evil. Nobody can doubt that something like the Holocaust was evil. And if there is a clear delineation of what is evil, then there must be something good to compare that evil to. And the Christian would say that God is the source of all that is good. If we're going to compare anything to something good, we must start with God. People will say that, look at all the genocide and the wicked things God commanded to be done in the Old Testament. Well, there's a book that I went through on this channel that answers much of that skepticism, straw manning that the new atheists bring. But then, in some incomprehensible way, as a result of this foulest evil, the world gasped in collective horror and discovered the impetus necessary for what so many had dreamt for so long. The people of Israel would be returned to their ancient homeland. And then almost overnight it happened. The nation of Israel was resurrected into the present time, leaping from the world of hopes and dreams into modern geography and history. It was an event so staggering that for many, it alone was proof of the God of Israel. In fact, 300 years earlier, while France's King Louis XIV asked the Christian mathematical genius Blaise Pascal for proof of God, Pascal answered easily in 2 words. Pascal said the proof of God was the Jews. For many, the mere continued existence of the Jewish people, scattered and persecuted throughout the millennia, was enough to prove that the God of the Jews was real and acted in history. But when they returned to the land from which they had been scattered 2 millennia earlier, no one could avoid the earth-shattering nature of the news, and many couldn't help seeing the hand of God in it. What could it be but a miracle? Now we're going to look at the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. But that same year, something else occurred with similarly astounding ramifications. It happened east of Jerusalem, along the cliffs, overlooking that watery wasteland called the Dead Sea. The superlatively saline body of water is 10 times as salty as the world's oceans, and at 1,400 feet below sea level, it marks the lowest point on our planet. Along the western shore of this fishless body of water, there are many cliffs riddled with caves. One day in early 1947, a 12-year-old Bedouin shepherd boy was watching his flocks in this area when, in what sounds like a reprisal of Jesus' parable about the lost sheep, he noticed one goat missing and left the rest of his flock to retrieve it. He found himself climbing the cliffs of this area, and in one remote crevice happened upon a very deep cave. Perhaps wondering whether his goat had wandered into the cave's interior, but more likely simply behaving as 12-year-old boys do, he flung a stone into the black depths of the cave. But the sound that followed was not rock striking rock, nor bleeding goat. Instead, the boy heard the report of smashed pottery. So he did something else we imagine his parents would earnestly have remonstrated against had they the opportunity. He ventured into the cave's depths to see what his stone had hit. Another shepherd's boy stone was said to have killed a certain Philistine not many miles from this spot. I think that's reference to David's stone killing Goliath. David the shepherd boy killing the Philistine Goliath. What has this stone done? This stone in 1947. In its own way, it would change history because as he crept into the darkness, the boy discovered that his missile had hit a large jar. He saw an entire cache of jars standing just as they must have been since someone placed them there long ago. Most were empty, but some still had their lids on. How could he resist? When he removed the lid and looked inside, he was amazed to see what appeared to be old scrolls covered with linen and black with age. We now know that in chasing after his wandering property, the shepherd boy had unwittingly stumbled upon one of the most astonishing discoveries of any century, for these scrolls were only the first of what was later discovered to be an almost limitless bounty of them, all in similar jars in 10 nearby caves. These jars and the scrolls within them had been untouched for 2,000 years. Eventually, the scrolls were found to number nearly 1,000, and the writing of them varied, ranging from pseudepigraphal and other extra-biblical documents to the writings of the Essenes, a religious sect that's from that area and time. But without question, the single most significant aspect of this find was that among these scrolls was a number of miraculously well-preserved manuscripts of Old Testament books. In fact, it was eventually determined that no less than 37 of the Old Testament's 39 books were represented. Who could have dreamt of such a thing? This alone would have made this archaeological discovery the most important of all time. As a result of this dramatically unexpected boon, scholars suddenly might answer the question they'd been wondering about forever, one they assumed would never be answered. Had the original biblical documents been tampered with over the centuries? And if so, how much? To what extent, if any, had the oft-cited monks of the Middle Ages been guilty of working with the church authorities to alter texts to better suit the theological narrative they wished to promote? Scholars had forever wished they might have copies of such texts from 2 millennia earlier, but knowing how manuscripts deteriorate, they knew this was essentially impossible. So the discovery of these scrolls, intact and legible, hidden in this cave for 20 centuries, was not merely stunning, but seemed providential to the point of miraculous. That they'd not deteriorated significantly in all this time was impossible to fathom, and yet there they were. When these get translated, when they're found to be consistent with what the scripture that we have in our hands today says, it shows that, contrary to the claims of some skeptics, God's word has not changed. An astonishing combination of wildly anomalous conditions all had to converge for such fragile and ancient objects to escape their fate. But as we now know, that is precisely what happened. To begin with, the location of these caves was far below sea level, as we've mentioned, in a place of near perfect aridity. Next, the scrolls were for unknown reasons made of sheepskins, but without the slightest trace of tanning materials, which accelerate the deterioration of parchments. Third, the ink used on the scrolls happened to be made of soot or lamp black, which is inert and therefore extremely long-lasting. And finally, the caves in which these scrolls were stored provided an environment of remarkably stable temperature and virtually no airflow. In other words, no better environment could be imagined. In fact, once the scrolls were examined, it was nearly impossible even for man-made technology to recreate an environment as perfect as the one in which they were discovered. So amidst these unrivaled circumstances in the silent and dark stillness, these scrolls waited through the silent hours and days of 20 centuries. In that time, many empires rose and fell. Halley's comet came and went 27 times. And then one day in 1947, as if in the fullness of time, a straying goat caused the door to be opened to the past. So what do these ancient manuscripts reveal? Indeed, it was an outrageous amount of information. So much, in fact, that the small-minded scholars who got their hands on them greedily hoarded them and proved slower than glaciers, and letting other scholars get a peek at them, marking a truly shameful but unfortunately not a typical act of academic pettiness. So it was nearly 50 years before these windows to another world could be looked through by a greater number of scholars. Surely the largest jewels in this dazzling treasury were the 2,000-year-old copies of the 37 books of the Bible, which showed that what we possess today as our own Bible is precisely the same as what existed then. There it is again. What we possess today as our own Bible is precisely the same as what existed then. Hasn't been corrupted. Never in human history has an observed absence of change so instantly and dramatically changed everything. This discovery within the larger discovery was earth-shattering, was the earth-shattering bombshell of the whole affair. Despite the unfounded but stubborn rumors that the Bible had been changed over the centuries, this unexpected evidence at last proved the opposite. As anyone could see, and as clearly as anyone might have hoped, the ancient Hebrew scriptures had been copied with a perfectly extraordinary faithfulness over the centuries. This illustrated that the reverence of the monks and Jewish scribes were believed to have toward their scriptures was no mere pious tale, but was simply true. Yes, great care was taken in the copying of the manuscripts. Copies were made, copies of copies were made. That's how it was transmitted down. The copying of the manuscripts was an important job. Those entrusted with that job, no doubt, had a reverence for God and knew the importance of the task, and were not going to maliciously tamper with it. It almost sounds like the new atheists allege that maliciousness has gone on with the manuscripts over the ages, and that the Word of God has been corrupted, they say, or even some in the church say that certain versions have corrupted the Word of God. Certain translations have corrupted the Word of God. And they are translations, and they're similar. Most of them are similar enough that there isn't this corruption that some claim that there are. It was manifestly proven by these ancient scrolls In a way, it conjured the idea of the very opposite of a game of telephone, in which time degrades a message into near nonsense. For the message and the words on these scrolls were exactly as they'd always been. And apart from the happenstance of that shepherd's boy discovery, no one would have ever known. Of course, those who believe in a providential God might believe that the discovery of these scrolls was anything but an accident. It was intended. And it helps us know, those who have lived in the centuries since the discoveries of the scrolls, since we've been able to have a copy of the scriptures, and living in an English-speaking country, since we've been able to have a copy of the scriptures since, what, the 16th century, 15th, 16th century, we've seen that even these scrolls that were discovered, they're similar enough to Textus Receptus that the King James was made from. And if these scrolls, since they were discovered in 1947, some of these are going to be the older manuscripts. These are going to be the older manuscripts that some scholars say are better because they're older. Even still, my understanding is that there's a large enough match between the quote-unquote older manuscripts versus the new. There's enough of a match that they're similar enough. That's my understanding. Among the very oldest of the scrolls were copies of the book Isaiah dating to the 4th century BC, meaning they were only 2 to 3 centuries removed from Isaiah himself, an unprecedentedly short period of time in the world of ancient manuscripts. And as we've said, those who examined it found the text identical to what we have now 26 centuries after Isaiah. Those who valued the Hebrew scriptures as sacred always knew they must be unchanged, for changing the very word of God would be a monstrous blasphemy. The Jewish and Christian scribes entrusted with copying these texts took almost unimaginably stringent measures to copy things so perfectly. I said something about that a few moments ago. Unimaginably stringent measures to copy things so perfectly that not only was no word changed, but not even the letters themselves. In Judaism, each letter was thought sacred. Many had the tiniest, but nonetheless deeply significant markings attached to them, which Jesus, in the King James translation of the Bible, refers to as a jot or tittle, in which he says will never pass away. The jot or tittle will never pass away or be changed. According to Jesus and to rabbis and Christian scholars forever, these markings were part of the Word of God and will therefore remain for eternity. All who understand this knew that the charges that the scriptures had cavalierly been changed could be made only by those ignorant of how these documents were transmitted over the centuries. Yes, it's sheer ignorance to claim that the Word of God's been corrupted over the centuries, because the scribes who preserved the originals by making these meticulous copies ensured that they were not corrupted. Now, there is some scribal error, but it's minimal. Even a noted atheist who was a former pastor, even he says that the copyist, the vast majority of the copyist errors in the manuscripts don't make a major theological difference in the text. Those biblical skeptics who argued that the documents were altered also held that because of this, Old Testament prophecies predicting the future did nothing of the kind. For them, all such prophecies were invented by an all-powerful church in order to control the ignorant faithful, and all examples were a simple case of later scribes inserting whatever they wished centuries after the fact. That's just coming up with something on the fly to try to eliminate the supernatural, which is what the skeptics do even today. But the scrolls discovery meant that such accusations like the church inventing whatever it wanted to fit their agenda, that was done away with the scrolls discovery, because with the scrolls discovery, it showed that what we have remains accurate. Such accusations must be set aside, and the bizarre parallels between what had been said and that centuries later seemed to have really happened must be dealt with seriously. Yes, so fulfilled prophecy must be dealt with seriously. Excuse me. One dramatic example of how the Old Testament was thought to prophesy the future is found in the 22nd Psalm, written 1,000 years before Jesus' day, but which very much seems to describe a Roman crucifixion and includes details from Jesus' own execution. And safe to say that the Roman soldiers who did these things to him weren't going to be thinking, hey, let's fulfill Psalm 22. No, they were not Jewish. They did not have the scriptural upbringing that the Jews did. The psalm even begins with the very words of Jesus. It begins with the very words. Let's try that again. The psalm even begins with the very words Jesus is said to have spoken on the cross at the point of his greatest suffering. So then Metaxas gives some of the verses from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? All those who see me ridicule me. They shoot out the lip, they shake the head, saying, he trusted in the Lord, let him rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. I'm poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue clings to my jaws. You brought me to the dust of death. They pierced my hands and my feet. I can count on my bones. They look and stare at me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Look at all those pronouns. My. Him. Notice how they're all capitalized. It shows that as we read it in our modern Bibles today, that we understood those references to be to deity. And then as the New Testament got completed, when we have the full picture, we can go back and we can see that it is Jesus and his death on the cross that fulfilled Psalm 22. Unless these ancient words really were somehow prophetic, how could this be? Of course, skeptics may now believe the New Testament writers inserted these details into their own writings to show Jesus fulfilling Old Testament scriptures. Nonetheless, these newly discovered scrolls, untouched since before the time of Christ, were shown to be unchanged, and people at last could judge for themselves. So, now that we've finished the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's go to Hezekiah's tunnel. This was the most, as I was reading this chapter, preparing for this presentation, this was the most staggering to me. The book of 2 Kings in the Bible is filled with one after the other of wicked kings doing evil in the Lord's sight. Over and over, we read how the people of Israel and Judah suffered as a result, usually being captured and oppressed by their enemies. So against this murderer's row of monarchs, the benevolent reign of King Hezekiah stands in dramatic contrast. According to the Bible, Hezekiah did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, just as his ancestor David had done. Hezekiah removed the pagan shrines, smashed the sacred pillars, and knocked down the Asherah poles. It even says that Hezekiah broke up the bronze snake that Moses had set up in the wilderness centuries before, because the people of God burned incense to it as though it were a pagan idol. Hezekiah removed idolatry. That's what made him, when you read through the books of Kings, you see over and over again, so-and-so did evil in the sight of the Lord, so-and-so did right in the sight of the Lord. Many times doing evil in the sight of the Lord had to do with promoting and allowing idolatry, and doing right in the sight of the Lord had to do with removing idolatrous influence. In the past few years, archaeological evidence for King Hezekiah has been mounting dramatically. In 2015, a bulla seal from around 700 BC was discovered in Jerusalem, bearing the inscription belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah. You can find this article online. Here's a picture of the Hezekiah seal that they found. Here's the link to the article about the King Hezekiah seal. It tells who led the group that found it. This is from March 2022. Just a centimeter in diameter. That's not very big. It's amazing that they can get a picture of such detail. It's with something so small. It's amazing that something so small wasn't just discarded. And so it goes on to talk about Hezekiah. Yeah, they said this is his royal seal. So, Dr. Eilat Mazar, who discovered the seal, said it was the closest thing we can ever get to something that was held by King Hezekiah himself. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Sennacherib, or Taylor Prism. But ample archaeological evidence for Hezekiah had already been discovered in the 19th century. In fact, evidence of him was first discovered in the city of Nineveh in 1830 by Colonel Robert Taylor. The Taylor Prism, as it's become known, is a hexagonal object of red baked clay 15 inches high and 5.5 inches in diameter that's covered with cuneiform writing. Here's a link to the article for the Taylor Prism. You can find articles online about these things. They used this to decipher cuneiform script. It preserved King Sennacherib's achievements. So there's even a video on the prism itself. So I just want to show you that you can find articles about each of these artifacts that Metaxas is mentioning in his book, Is Atheism Dead? All right. Two virtually identical objects called the Sennacherib Prism and the Oriental Institute Prism turned up in the decades following. But when Taylor found it, no one could yet read cuneiform, and yet Taylor had no idea what he'd found. The object languished, as many archaeological treasures do, while in that strange limbo between what we may call its first and second discoveries, the former being the unearthing of an object and the latter being the time when someone realizes its true significance. For the Taylor Prism, the second discovery did not happen until 3 decades later, at which point it was determined that one cuneiform passage actually referred to Sennacherib's military campaign against King Hezekiah from Judah, linking it to the events in the Bible. So, part of the text on this prism describes events that are recorded in Scripture. Just as the Black Obelisk had done in 1851, we discussed that in a previous chapter, and the Moabite stone would do spectacularly in 1868, which we discussed in a previous chapter. The translated cuneiform passage from the Taylor Prism reads, quote, "As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his 40 fortified cities, along with many smaller towns, taken in battle with my battering rams. I took as plunder, maybe that's 200,150 people, both small and great, male and female, along with a great number of animals, including horses, mules, donkeys, camels, oxen, and sheep. As for Hezekiah, I shut him up like a caged bird in his royal city of Jerusalem. I then constructed a series of fortresses around him, and I did not allow anyone to come out of the city gates. His towns, which I've captured, I gave to the kings of Ashdod, Ekron, and Gaza." That number of people, that's got to be a typo on my part. It's typical of such things that the writer boasts of his victories, but as we see, he does not mention actually taking the city of Jerusalem, only of besieging it. so we may assume the siege was unsuccessful. But it was not until two teenagers were playing hooky from school in 1880 that we would know the precise reason and dimensions of Hezekiah's success in defending Jerusalem. Now we're going to discuss Hezekiah's tunnel. Like I said, this was the one that was most fascinating to me in this chapter. During Hezekiah's time, the principal source of water for Jerusalem was the Gihon Spring. In fact, the spring and the 600,000 cubic meters of water that flow from it annually seem to have been the very reason human beings settled in this spot in the 4th millennium BC, making it one of the world's oldest cities. The spring is still today considered one of the major intermittent springs in the world. By the time of King Hezekiah, it not only provided all the drinking water for the city's inhabitants, but also was sufficient to irrigate the Kidron Valley beyond the city walls, where many in Jerusalem grew their crops. That spring, then, was the supplier of a lot of water for people in that area, in Jerusalem, the Kidron Valley. When Hezekiah discovered that a siege by Assyria's fearsome king Sennacherib was imminent, it was precisely this ample overflow beyond Jerusalem's walls that concerned him. Hezekiah knew that because of this, Sennacherib's men would have all the water they needed, enabling them to remain there for many months, continuing their siege. In preparation for the coming siege, King Hezekiah strengthened the city's fortifications. So King Hezekiah knows that King Sennacherib is about to attack him, and he wants to help that attack not to be successful. So if he cuts off their water supply, if he cuts off the water supply so that Israel has access to it, but Sennacherib doesn't, that's going to help Hezekiah and Israel. But he had another idea too, one that was exceedingly clever and far more ambitious. Hezekiah would cut off the water supply flowing into the Kidron Valley and deprive Sennacherib of this advantage during his siege. In the scriptures we read that Hezekiah diverted the water so that it remained inside Jerusalem. Here's the scripture passage that talks about this. 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 20. Now the rest of the acts of King Hezekiah, all his might, how he made a pool and a tunnel, and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And in 2 Chronicles 32, verses 2 to 4. And when Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib would come, and that his purpose was to make war against Jerusalem, he consulted with his leaders and commanders to stop the water from the springs which were outside the city, and they helped him. Thus many people gathered, who stopped all the springs in the brook that ran through the land, saying, Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water? This picture, I think, is going to stay up for a while, but here's a picture of the route that the tunnel takes. But as we mentioned, it was not until 1880 that we had confirmation of exactly how Hezekiah had done this. This was when a truant teenager unwittingly stumbled, literally and figuratively, upon the inscription that identified the tunnel beneath Jerusalem as Hezekiah's tunnel. It was only then that the world learned that those few brief lines in the scriptures referred to an engineering project of the most ambitious kind. As a result of that discovery, we now understand that Hezekiah's ingenious plan for keeping the waters of the Gihon Spring within the walls of Jerusalem involved digging a tunnel through the living rock beneath the city. That would not have been easy. They're not going to have the modern tools at their disposal that we have that make it possible to dig through rock. So I wonder what they did. There were already some natural or so-called karstic pathways here and there under the subterranean spaces beneath the city, but most of the planned tunnel would need to be laborious carved with chisels and pickaxes. Wow. That's going to take a lot of work. For reasons still unknown, the tunnel would take a sinuous path rather than a straight line, all the curves that you see in the picture below, and eventually measured nearly 600 yards. The descent of this tunnel from the Gihon Spring, if you look at the bottom right of the picture, it has a map, and there's a key on the map, and it tells you that the Gihon Spring, if you can locate the number 1 on the map, let's see if we can, oh, there it is. It's on the right, on the far right, where the dots for the tunnel end. Look a little bit to the right of that. You'll see a number 2, and then to the right of the 2, almost parallel to the 2, is the number 1. So that's the number 1 is the Gaihon Spring, according to the picture at the bottom. So the descent of the tunnel from the Gaihon Spring, that's the Gaihon Spring, to the Pool of Siloam. The Pool of Siloam is the number 3. The Pool of Siloam is all the way on the left. It's a little bit further down than the numbers 1 and 2, but it's on the opposite side. It's on the left, and it's sort of parallel with Metaxas' head. So hopefully you found those. Pause the video if you need to find those. So the descent of the tunnel from the Gaihon Spring to the Pool of Siloam. That's where it's saying that it is. As gradual as can be, differing only by a single foot in its third of a mile journey, just enough for what its engineers had in mind. Of course, the first discovery of the tunnel predated its second discovery in 1880 when the inscription was found. Its first discovery in recent centuries comes to us from the writer Franciscus Quaresnius in 1625. Franciscus Quaresnius writes of his friend, a certain Vinhuin, whose attempt to clamber through the length of the subterranean passage was unsuccessful. It records the successful attempt of a priest, Pater Julius, a few years earlier. So there were some who knew of this tunnel, but no one knew of its extraordinary provenance from the reign of King Hezekiah. So there were people who knew this tunnel existed, but they didn't know that it was connected to King Hezekiah from the Bible. After this early 17th century mention, however, the historical record goes silent. Although some visitors to the Holy Land do write about the mysterious flow of water that seems to travel all the way from the Gaihon Spring, in those days called the Virgin's Fountain, to the Siloam Pool. That's what we said. It starts by the Gaihon Spring and goes all the way to the Pool of Siloam. Wondering whether the flow from one to the other might be facilitated by underground pipes, and wondering in which direction the waters traveled. Okay, so yes, the water goes from the Gaihon Spring all the way on the right, all the way to the Pool of Siloam. But in 1838, the great Sir Edward Robinson galloped onto the scene. He was the one that discovered Robinson's arch that was connected to the Second Temple. I think that was discussed in a previous chapter. This is the renowned American Bible scholar who discovered Robinson's arch, which was connected to the supporting wall of the Second Temple, whose encyclopedic knowledge of the Scriptures and indefatigable spirit in roaming across every inch of the then unmapped Holy Land enabled him to make what amounted to a roaring cataract of identifications during his time there, such that his subsequent book, the title of Robinson's book is Biblical Researches in Palestine, Mount Sinai, and Arabia, Petria, a Journal of Travels in the year 1838. So Robinson's book would become a handbook for travelers for the century following, in which, published in 1841, became the magnum opus of the man soon heralded as the father of biblical geography. The German theologian The German theologian Albrecht Echt noted that Robinson was able definitively to disprove a large part of what his predecessors had thought and had written, laying once and for all a firm and trustworthy foundation in the field, one that has been built upon ever since. In the manner that would vault him to the fore of the field, Robinson minutely notes all those who'd written of this passage before, and says that many of the locals whom he and his companion Eli Smith, also a biblical scholar from Connecticut, spoke with, had heard of the existence of a passageway all the way from the Gaihon Spring to the Siloam Pool, but they were also united in the widespread belief that the interior of the Serpentine Cave harbored a dragon, or was otherwise haunted by a jinn or a demon, which accounts for their failure to have explored it themselves. Yes, people were too afraid to look for it because of those reasons. It is worth noting, too, that Nehemiah in the scriptures refers to a dragon's well during his own explorations of the city walls, and the local memory of this seems to have informed the situation over the centuries. Robinson records every mention of the written records from Jerome in the late 4th century through various crusaders to his own time. So Robinson and Smith vowed to explore what they could of this purported tunnel when the opportunity presented itself. On April 27th, they found themselves measuring and exploring the Pool of Siloam, and seeing they were alone and the level of water quite low, calculated to be as good a time as any to begin. And so, carrying lighted candles and measuring tape, they ventured forward into this unknown fissure. They observed that the passage, never more than 2 feet wide, had indeed been carved through the living rock, and that while it for the first 40 yards had a comfortable height of 15 or 20 feet, it began to decrease gradually for the next 100 feet, until the ceiling had descended to 4 feet, after which their progress became increasingly difficult. Still, they kept on, Robinson writes. Quote, at the end of 800 feet, it became so low that we could advance no further without crawling on all fours and bringing our bodies close to the water. As we were not prepared for this, we thought it better to retreat and try again another day from the other end. Tracing therefore upon the roof with the smoke of our candles and the initials of our names and the figure 800 as a mark of our progress on this side, we returned with our clothes somewhat wet and soiled. So they made part of their progress through the tunnel. 3 days later, they'd explored the tunnel from the opposite end at what was called the Virgin's Fountain. Is that in our picture? Not sure. The Virgin's Fountain that is and is now called the Gihon Spring. Yes, it's there. Number 1, all the way on the right. Their above-ground measurements were correct. They optimistically put that portion of the tunnel remaining for them to explore to be in the neighborhood of about 300 feet, never guessing that the inexplicable curvature and zigzagging of the tunnel put the true distance remaining at much closer to 3 times that long. Nonetheless, the doughty explorers were not easily discouraged. Quote, having clothed or unclothed themselves simply in a pair of white Arab drawers, we entered and crawled on, hoping soon to arrive at the point which we had reached from the other fountain. The passage here is in general much lower than at the other end. Most of the way we could indeed advance upon our hands and knees, yet at several places we could only get forward by lying at full length and dragging ourselves along on our elbows. Yikes, end quote. Can you imagine? You couldn't even get on all fours, you'd have to crawl. The two of them found themselves like eels exploring the long mistakes painstakingly carved by the workmen from another age, only having to turn back when they realized these were false leads culminating in dead ends like appendices of some antediluvian monster. So they went down some wrong paths that other people had found. So they wasted some time doing that. Nonetheless, they traversed each of these, examining them minutely, and each time backtracked to what they gathered must be the correct way forward. The way seemed interminably long, and we for a time were suspicious that we had fallen on a passage different from that which we had before entered. That must be Robinson again. But at length, having measured 950 feet, we had arrived at our former mark of 800 feet, traced with smoke upon the ceiling, end quote. After this, they continued on, predictably emerging at Siloam's pool, where they'd entered 3 days earlier. Robinson says, in a footnote, that Quaresmius's correspondent Vinhun had published an account of his own efforts, while they now recognized as remarkably similar to their own, although he'd not been as successful. He entered at the upper end, Gihon, creeping on his hands and knees, and sometimes at full length, until in a low spot his candle went out, and he could neither strike a light nor turn around without great difficulty. Wow. At length he extricated himself and returned, although well soaked and full of dirt. End quote. The following day, Vinhon did the opposite of what they had, entering at the lower end, the Siloam pool end, And that's number 3. I put a red box around it on the left. Van Hoen entered at the Siloam pool end, but did not make it all the way through. Robinson deduced the tunnel had been dug from both ends simultaneously, and even more brilliantly surmised that when it was created, both ends of the tunnel must have been inside the walls of Jerusalem. He writes that it appears as if the advantage of a fortified city had been taken into account, and as if it had been important to carry this water from one point to the other in such a way that it could not be cut off by a besieging army. Yes, Robinson deduces that whoever created this tunnel wanted to make sure that the entire thing was inside the city walls so that the enemies couldn't get to it, which was the whole point that we said in the beginning of the section. Robinson comes so close to cracking the code of this venerable mystery that it seems even more remarkable given his superlative knowledge of the Bible that he did not. Taking into account how much Robinson contributed to the biblical archaeology and geography, it seems fitting that the honor of linking this literal passage linking Gihon to Siloam to the literary passage in the scriptures to another. That's Captain Charles Warren. On the right, the next candidate, accidentally to try his luck, was the celebrated Sir Charles Warren, a much-decorated British officer chosen by Queen Victoria to lead the Palestine Exploration Fund, of which she was a patron. He unwittingly entered the lists of this competition when he began the first extensive archaeological exploration of the Temple Mount in 1867, inaugurating the excavations that have continued there ever since. During this time, he discovered what is today known as Warren's Shaft, a natural karstic vertical shaft 45 feet tall that is connected to the Gihon Spring, and explored various parts of the tunnel Robinson had traversed, and describing all of his efforts and discoveries in his, that would be, 1887 opus, maybe, it's typo, The Recovery of Jerusalem, a narrative of exploration and discovery in the city of the Holy Land. Let's see what this link for Warren Shaft gives us. Here it is. It says it was discovered by Charles Warren. It was used to access the Gihon spring water inside the safety of the city walls, just what we've been saying. So there's articles you can look up, like this one. So Robinson traversed and this shaft and described his efforts and his discoveries in his, let's say, 1887 opus, The Recovery of Jerusalem, a narrative of exploration and discovery in the city and Holy Land. To his credit, Warren did not suggest that the Pool of Siloam may have been dug by Hezekiah, but this was as far as he got in plumbing the depths of our narrow subject. So it was not until a 15-year-old boy decided to play hooky from English mission school in 1880 that the author of the tunnel came to light, and its second and significant discovery was at last made, forever linking the daunting passage to the biblical verses concerning Hezekiah. The boy, on whose head the laurel of this honor would rest, was a Sephardic Jewish teenager named Jacob Elihu Spafford, who 2 years after this triumph was adopted by Horatio Spafford, the Chicago businessman who was a friend of D.L. Moody, and who is known for maybe transmitting the bitter heartbreak of a family tragedy into the hymn "It Is Well With My Soul," and who afterward moved his family to Jerusalem, where they set up an American colony. In 1950, no less than 70 years after his exploit, Elihu's surviving sister, Bertha, wrote a memoir of her life in Jerusalem and told the otherwise unknown story of her brother's adventure. She heard him tell it innumerable times, often to archaeologists interested in the subject, always saying a schoolboy had discovered the inscription revealing the historic truth of the tunnel, but never mentioning that he himself was the schoolboy. Well, that's humble and modest. That's good. Bertha wrote that her adopted brother was above the average in intellect, speaking 5 languages fluently with a partial knowledge of several others. She said he always recalled that the tunnel was said to be haunted by a dragon or a genie. Nevertheless, he determined to explore the tunnel. She continued, Bertha Because of its reputation for being haunted, he had some trouble persuading his friend Samson, a boy about his own age, to explore it with him, but at last he was persuaded. Samson was persuaded by Elihu. The boys kept their plan a profound secret. They had no idea of the height or width or length of the tunnel, nor how deep the water was. They prepared floats with candles and matches attached, and tied these around their necks with strings. Jacob started from the Pool of Siloam side, Samson entered from the Virgin's Fount. Their plan was to meet in the middle. Jacob found himself in total darkness and muddy water up to his chin. Gosh. It was cold and drafty in the tunnel. His candle blew out. His float with the matches submerged in the water. He could not relight the candle. Oh, that would be terrifying. But he kept on, going his way by keeping his hand on the damp stone wall and feeling under his fingertips the mark of the ancient chisels going forward, right to left. So I guess he could tell the direction to go. He could tell the direction the tunnel was being dug. Jacob, feeling his way, suddenly was conscious that the chisel marks had changed and were now going from left to right. So that means that they're meeting. According to his sister's account, 7 decades later, Jacob bravely soldiered forward in the perfect darkness of the watery passage, hoping to encounter his friend, but never did. Eventually, he found himself emerging into the blinding daylight at the Guyon Spring, shocking some washerwomen who shrieked at him. This was where Samson supposedly had entered, but even here he was nowhere to be seen. It seems he quickly lost heart in the frightening tunnel and simply returned to school. Oh boy. So Jacob was on his own. So Jacob at last returned to the school too, looking notably bedraggled. He confessed the details of his absence to his teacher, who was none other than the German architect and archaeologist Conrad Schick, pictured below, who must have been amazed to hear of this. And who was more than amazed when, in the course of Jacob's confession, the boy let slip a detail from the beginning of his journey. It seems that only 18 feet into the tunnel from the Pool of Siloam, Jacob had slipped and fallen into the water. But upon recovering himself, his eyes lit upon what seemed to be an inscription on the tunnel's limestone wall. If Schick had any plans of disciplining the boy, we imagined that it was here that he kicked them aside, instead skedaddling lickety-split to see the extraordinary inscription for himself. To be an archaeologist alive when something like this should be discovered, and for one's own troubling pupil to have discovered it. Yes, so we're talking about another misbehaving boy, this troublemaking pupil, and this is the misbehaving boy is Jacob, and he's told his teacher, archaeologist Conrad Schick, what he had found. And so Schick, the archaeologist, wants to see this inscription that Jacob found. Sure enough, precisely where the boy had said, there it was still. And there, for 26 centuries, it had been, in the darkness, as we know now. The inscription was so encrusted with mineral deposits, it was hardly surprising it had never been noticed before, especially since it was far enough in the dark tunnel not to be easily seen. Schick could not make out what it said, but knew enough to believe this could be significant and announced it publicly, so that months later it came to the attention of Oxford's premier Assyriologist, Dr. Archibald Sayce, mentioned previously as the man who identified the language of the Hittites, who was then in Jerusalem. Sayce investigated the inscription himself, twice wading into the darkened tunnel. The inscription lay just at water level, and each time he had to crouch uncomfortably in the water for an hour while a friend held a candle, and Sayce copied what he could make out of the ancient lettering, including the bottom 4 inches of the inscription, which were perpetually underwater. According to Sayce, the inscription was written in Paleo-Hebrew, typical of what would have been used during King Hezekiah's time. So, there we go. Here's this tunnel. The tunnel has an inscription. The language of the inscription is the same language that's used during the time of King Hezekiah. So the inscription's that old, and you've got the tunnel that is dug like the scriptures said it was going to be dug. So you've got this corroborating evidence to the scriptural narrative. And despite the rather poor quality of the inscription, Sayce's efforts at deciphering the inscriptions were quite successful. After his visit, hydrochloric acid was used to remove some of the mineral deposits so the letters could be seen more clearly, but little was added to what Sayce had already deciphered. And when Sayce learned someone had touched this ancient treasure, he was outraged, fearing it had destroyed the fragile writing, but thankfully it did not. The inscription proved unlike anything expected and clarified what was necessary to solve the mystery, since the lettering confirmed a date around Hezekiah's reign. It told the tale of two teams working with pickaxes from either end, as the chisel marks confirmed, hoping to meet in the middle. It has been surmised that there was some sort of competition, because as they neared the midpoint of each team's forward progress, there seems to have taken precedence over the tunnel's height. Let's see. They just were trying to work fast, even if that meant not having a tall tunnel to work in. As they finally drew near to each other, they could hear each other's voices at the end, and in a flurry, they rushed to complete the task. So they're digging from opposite ends toward each other. Finally, they can hear each other's voices. So they're getting excited because they can hear each other. They know they've almost dug all the way through. And now they rush because they can hear each other. The inscription reads, quote, "And this is the story of the tunnel, while the axes were against each other, and while 3 cubits were left to cut, the voice of a man called to his counterpart, for there was an unknown word in the rock on the right. And on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stonecutters struck each man towards his counterpart, axe against axe, and flowed water from the source of the pool for 1,200 cubits. And 100 cubits was the height over the head of the stonecutters." End quote. Okay, so why should we care? What should we know about this inscription? Let's see. There's an article here about the Siloam inscription. Let's see what it says. "The essential recognition of the significance and truth of the Bible has been obliged by the archaeological discoveries of the past several decades. Our knowledge of the civilizations and history which flourished in the Fertile Crescent of old is better known today than any other period of human history. It has now become possible to examine more closely both culture and language. This possibility is brought to us by the findings of archaeologists. An example such a finding that opens our eyes to the historicity of the biblical text is the Siloam tunnel and the inscription." Okay, so that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the inscription. 2 Chronicles 32, verses 2-4 says, "When Hezekiah saw Sennacherib had come and intended to fight against Jerusalem, he planned with his officers and mighty men to stop the water of the springs that were outside the city, and they helped him. A great many people were gathered, and they stopped all the springs in the brook that flowed through the land, saying, 'Why should the kings of Assyria come and find much water?' These events occurred in approximately 701 BC. The king Sennacherib of Assyria laid siege on Hezekiah in Jerusalem. Hezekiah wanted to get the water from the Gaian spring to his troops in all of Jerusalem without getting water to the Assyrians. Hezekiah commissioned his engineers to secure his water source by building a tunnel to divert the water, just what we've been reading about in Is Atheism Dead? The water from the Gaihan was diverted into the Gai Wadi by means of a tunnel that was 1,750 feet long. That was the tunnel that we just read about that the people were digging at from opposite ends. 2 Kings 20:20 says Hezekiah made a pool and a conduit and brought water into the city. So it's the tunnel that joins the Gaihan spring through the rock to the Pool of Siloam. So the inscription, okay, and then it says that they found the inscription. Let's go down here. The major portion of the inscription describes the moments when the tunnel was being completed. The inscription was cut into the wall inside the entrance. The inscription records how two groups of workers started from opposite ends, digging through the solid rock underground until meeting in the middle. The inscription says that 1,200 cubits is approximately 1,700 feet, which confirms the biblical measurement for a cubit to equal 18 inches as Josephus cites for the construction of Herod's temple. So, in discussing the building achievements of King Hezekiah, the Bible mentions a tunnel that he had dug under the city of Jerusalem to supply the water to the upper part of the city. Even though this inscription does not refer to King Hezekiah, the tunnel was almost without doubt constructed during Hezekiah's period of influence. The 8th century BC dating of the inscription is established by the style of the letters. So you can tell that it comes from Hezekiah's era because of the style of the letters and the unique grammar and spelling. Okay, furthermore, the inscription counters the arguments of those who argue that the Bible's account of the monarchic period is insignificant. The discovery of the Siloam tunnel confirms what the Bible had already said about King Hezekiah. The Siloam inscription that was found in the tunnel is arguably the most precious of all ancient Hebrew inscriptions. The inscription currently resides in the Museum of the Ancient Orient in Istanbul, Turkey. So that was most of the article about the Siloam inscription. And you can find other articles that talk about the inscription. Okay, now that we're done with the Siloam inscription, we're going to move on to the Silver Ketef Hinnom Scrolls. Just outside Jerusalem, literally under the old road from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, are a number of rock-hewn burial chambers. Most were looted long ago, but in 1979, Gabriel Barkay, pictured below, today an archaeologist with Tel Aviv University, thought worthy of further exploration. But when he and his team investigated them, the pickings were slimmer than hoped. The oldest thing they found was evidence that one of the chambers was used by the Ottoman Turks to hide their rifles 2 centuries before. Considering what Barkay had envisioned, it was disheartening. One chamber had initially seemed promising. It had a series of headrests and burial benches, Barkay remembered. One bench was shaped like a cushion with 6 headrests. One bead was found that had been part of burial gifts. Under the bench, we discovered a repository and saw something that looked like a rock floor. I was disappointed, Barkay says, end quote. Most archaeologists struggle to have their investigations funded, and to keep costs down, they often call upon university students studying archaeology. At the time of this dig, Barkay was teaching archaeology at Tel Aviv University, but was a young man still 6 years from getting his PhD. Getting funding, much less university students to help, was out of the question. But the Society for the Protection of Nature in Israel offered a very modest budget, as well as some 12 and 13-year-olds belonging to a local archaeology club. The presence and help of these kids was not ideal. 13 is a dangerous age, Barkay remembered. But it was all that was offered, and somewhat reluctantly, Barkay accepted. As the work began, Barkay found one of the kids from his archaeology club to be more than merely unhelpful. In fact, he was strikingly annoying, pulling at Barkay's shirt tails every few minutes and generally being a nuisance. So when Barkay came up with a way to get the boy out from underfoot, he leapt at it. It happened that the promising chamber 25, was relatively distant from the rest. It proved to be a disappointment, but would nonetheless need to be photographed, and before that would need to be cleaned. Barkay hit on the capital idea of dispatching the irritating 12-year-old. His name was Nathan, to do the job. He would be out of sight and earshot for a blissful hour or two. Years later, Barkay recalled realizing the boy would require unmistakably firm and clear direction. I told Nathan, Barkay says, the repository had to be as clean as his mother's kitchen, even if he had to lick it. Nice. With these marching orders, the boy trundled off to the distant chamber. But it turned out Nathan could be trouble from a distance, too. For reasons lost to archaeological history, the 12-year-old snuck a hammer with him into chamber 25. While taking a break from cleaning, whether out of boredom, an excess of undirected energy, or both, he began to smash the stone floor of the repository under the bench. Had Barkay witnessed this, he would have shrieked at Nathan to stop. But of course Barkay was far away, relishing the peace of the boy's absence. As the story goes, under the child's inane hammering, the solid rock of the chamber's floor revealed itself not to be as solid as thought. The pre-adolescent's mindless tattoo eventually proved more than it could bear, and a crack revealed itself, encouraging further hammering. Eventually Nathan was elated to see that his surfeit of youthful energy had opened a hidden chamber beneath the floor, so he reached in and immediately put his hand to a pair of intact pottery vessels. As we might imagine, the boy felt that this, rather than cleaning, was why he was here in the first place, and he excitedly fled to the chamber to locate Barkay, proudly showing him the two vessels. Barkay was nonplussed. Why had Nathan returned? And what were these ancient ceramics doing in his hands? When Barkay understood what had happened, he raced to the chamber. It seemed that this memorably pesky kid, by smashing what everyone believed to be a solid stone floor, had magically opened the door to archaeological history. Of course, at that time, Barkay had no idea what else might be in the hole Nathan had hammered into the past. Still, it seemed far more promising than what Barkay himself had found. Although he knew the boy had implausibly coaxed fire from the rock, so to speak, he also guessed that the aggravating child had, in this violent act, probably accomplished his divine purpose, so he now sent Nathan and his young archaeology club confederates home. But the heady promise of this uncannily opened cache suddenly enabled Barkay to recruit actual archaeology students from nearby universities. So Barkay got excited about what this boy inadvertently uncovered, so Barkay calls actual university students. With their help, he could now excavate his new find in earnest. The pastor of St. Andrew's, the Scottish church located just above the excavation site, brought down an electrical hookup, and by lamplight, Barkay and his team of students worked around the clock. Barkay could never quite fathom the screwball madness of how the secret chamber had bloomed to life, but now he and his graduate students busied themselves in unearthing one item after another, and they were all from before the 6th century BC. There was no getting around it. The strikingly irksome child and his magic hammer had opened the door to an Aladdin's treasure of objects from pre-exilic Israel. It seemed something from a fevered dream. Among the findings were 120 objects of silver, 40 iron arrowheads, gold, ivory, glass, bone, and 150 semi-precious stones. There were also skeletal remains. Of course, most of this was under 2 feet of filth, Barkay remembered. There was a lot of dust and a lack of oxygen. It was very hot. We had to change teams every few hours. There was a lady who was in charge of coffee and sandwiches. Everyone was sworn to secrecy. They weren't allowed to tell parents, spouses, or friends. If word got around Jerusalem that there was such a treasure, the California gold rush would be nothing compared to what would happen here. A young woman named Judy Hadley from Toledo, Ohio, was among those helping. At some point, she brought a decidedly strange-looking object to Barkay, which she later described as purplish-colored and looking like a cigarette butt. In fact, there were 2 such objects, both of them tremendously fragile-looking. What in the world were they? They turned out to be something almost imaginable. An impossibly tiny pair of scrolls made of the purest silver. That's them pictured up there in the top right. Who could have dreamed up such a thing? And they were so extremely delicate that Barkay didn't dare try to unroll them, knowing they would fracture into pieces. But even in their rolled state, he saw that the writing on them was in ancient Hebrew characters. He recognized the Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh letters of the divine name, the Tetragrammaton that we usually write as Yahweh or Jehovah, and which many Bibles translate as the Lord in all capitals. Of course, there was more writing inside, but how to read it? So these scrolls that Barkay's team finds say the Lord, and they say something else. So already we've got biblical writing on these scrolls. So the biblical stories are being preserved, and they're being put on materials, and these materials are getting buried, and thousands of years later these materials are getting uncovered. They're getting dug up, and they are our links to the Bible text, saying that this is no mere fiction, but this is actual history. Okay, so there was more writing inside, but how to read it. This would take no less than 3 years to figure out, and would eventually involve infrared imaging technology. But at last, they were able to unroll them safely and decipher what was inscribed. What was inscribed was a shock. The writing was nothing less than the priestly blessing found in the book of Numbers, chapter 6, which reads, "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." End quote. There's a contemporary song with that verse in it. It's called The Blessing, I believe. It turned out to be the oldest example of writing from the Bible anywhere in the world, and is still the oldest today, to this day. The well-known blessing forms a centrally important place in Jewish tradition, being the same words spoken by Moses' brother Aaron over the Hebrew people. It's generally done with both of the priest's hands raised over the assembly, and what modern-day audience would likely recognize as the Vulcan "live long and prosper" hand formation used by Leonard Nimoy's Spock character in the 1960s TV show Star Trek. But there was a further question concerning the scrolls that could not be solved even after they were unrolled in 1982, and this concerned the age of the scrolls. Answering that conclusively would take another 22 years, because it was not until 2004 that there existed computer enhancement and photography techniques advanced enough to properly re-examine the writing, at which time a University of Southern California team did just that. It then became clear to all parties what they had hoped. The writing was, in fact, Proto-Hebraic lettering dating from the last years of the pre-exilic period, 650 to 587 BC, just before Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. So it was, So it was not until 2004 that it was confirmed beyond question that this prayer, which appears in the Bible, was known during this very early period, 650 to 587 BC. So the diminutive scrolls summoned into the present by young Nathan's unorthodox methods really were the earliest portions of Scripture in the world, decisively pushing back the known existence of biblical texts several centuries, and making this particularly unexpected discovery among the most important finds in archaeological history. Though neither Barkay nor anyone ever learned what happened to him, one hopes Nathan might, via this book, Is Atheism Dead?, or this video, or other means, learn of the starring role he played in this drama, and of how it was his indefatigably annoying behavior that delivered him to the very spot where everyone else ought to have been looking in the first place. And that also seems to have caused the destruction of an ancient stone floor that had been hiding such treasures as none could have imagined. These, then, are the strange facts. The extraordinary misbehavior of one 12-year-old in 1979 led to the discovery of the oldest biblical text in existence. The misbehavior of another in 1947 led to the greatest archaeological discovery of all time. And the misbehavior of a 15-year-old in 1880 led to the discovery of Hezekiah's tunnel and the corroboration of one of the most dramatic accomplishments of any monarch in the Scriptures. And so the question comes, why? Why should three boys, all doing things their parents and caretakers would have loudly forbidden, be the ones to open the doors to some of the greatest treasures in the Bible's past? It is either a coincidence or a conundrum, or perhaps it is something else altogether, to which we may find a clue in the first century letter written to the Christians living in the city of Corinth. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 to 29. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty, and the base things of the world, and the things which are despised God has chosen, and the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, that no flesh should glory in his presence. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 to 29. So God is using misbehaving boys, what some people would consider foolish, to show wise people like Barkay that God is at work, even in the midst of their foibles. We serve a big God. Next time, we will discuss the chapter on the New Testament manuscripts in Is Atheism Dead by Eric Metaxas. So please like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for tuning in. And I hope you have a blessed rest of your day.